In Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, 8 miles north of Philadelphia's City Hall, there stands a limestone palace that has outlived nearly everyone who built it. Linwood Hall, 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet of Indiana limestone and steel, arranged in a T shape that stretches 268 feet across its principal facade. 6 Corinthian columns rise 2 stories to support a pediment carved with figures no one can identify anymore. Behind them, a ballroom once held 1,000 guests waltzing beneath an 18th century ceiling fresco by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo. Salvaged from an Italian palazzo and shipped across the Atlantic in crates. 14 Rembrandts hung on these walls. A Vermeer, works by Raphael, El Greco, Titian, Van Dyck. The collection was valued at more than $15 million in 1942, a figure that would be meaningless today, because what Peter Arrell Brown Widener assembled in these galleries now hangs in the National Gallery in Washington, available to anyone, for free. The art survived. The house survived. Most of the family did not. On a single April night in 1912, 2 of the men meant to inherit this estate were lost in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. A father, 50 years old, a son, 27, with a rare 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's essays reportedly in his coat pocket. Their bodies were never recovered. At Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, their names are carved into the family mausoleum, but the vaults behind those names are empty. The patriarch who built Linwood Hall survived them by 3 years. He died in this house in 1915, after what contemporaries described as prolonged poor health. His great-grandson, decades later, would call the place a museum, not a home, as cold and as formal as if real people didn't live here. This is the story of that museum, the fortune that built it, the ship that broke it, and the heir who chose to go down with the most famous ocean liner in history rather than take his chances in a lifeboat. It begins not with icebergs or rare books, but with mutton. Peter Arrell Brown. Widener was born on November 13, 1834, in Philadelphia, to German immigrant parents of modest means. His father worked as a bricklayer. The family lived in the cramped streets of the city's northern wards, among laborers and tradesmen who spoke German at home and English in the markets. Nothing in the circumstances of his birth suggested that within 50 years, Peter Widener would be worth more than $100 million a fortune that American Heritage would later rank as the 29th largest in the nation's history, equivalent to $23 billion in modern currency. The path from bricklayer's son to traction magnate ran through meat. Widener apprenticed as a butcher in his youth and eventually opened his own shop. He was competent, but competence does not build dynasties. What built the Widener fortune was timing, opportunity, and a willingness to move when others hesitated. In 1861, as the Civil War began consuming men and material at unprecedented rates, the Union Army needed provisions for the troops massing around Philadelphia. Widener secured a contract to supply mutton to soldiers stationed within 10 miles of the city. The contract was worth $50,000 a sum that would translate to roughly $1.5 million today. It was not a fortune. It was seed capital. By the war's end, Widener had accumulated enough to begin investing in Philadelphia's emerging streetcar lines. He found a partner in William Lukens Elkins, another self-made man with ambitions that matched his own. Together, in 1883, they founded the Philadelphia Traction Company, consolidating the city's scattered horse-drawn rail lines into a single system. Within a decade, They controlled public transportation not only in Philadelphia but in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. The 5-cent fare paid by workers commuting to factories flowed upward into accounts that grew beyond counting. The methods were not examined too closely at the time. Decades later, the muckraker Gustavus Myers would charge in his History of the Great American Fortunes that Widener and his associates had bribed Philadelphia City Council members to secure their franchises. Lincoln Steffens, in his 1903 exposé, called Philadelphia corrupt and contented, a city where political machines and business interests had merged so completely that distinguishing between them required a cynic's eye. Widener's name appeared in these accounts not as a villain, but as a fact of the landscape, like the streetcar tracks themselves. By 1887, he had built a townhouse at Broad Street and Girard Avenue, designed by Willis G. Hale in the fashionable style of the era. He began collecting art cautiously at first, then with increasing appetite. The walls filled, the rooms overflowed. He would need a larger house, but first, a marriage. In 1883, the same year the Philadelphia Traction Company was founded, Widener's eldest son George married Eleanor Elkins, the daughter of his father's business partner. The union joined two streetcar fortunes into one. It also, though no one could have known it then, set in motion a sequence of events that would end 3 decades later in the North Atlantic, in water 31 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 hours before dawn. Among Peter Widener's many investments was a significant stake in the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust that controlled several transatlantic lines. One of its subsidiaries was the White Star Line. One of White Star's ships, not yet built in 1883, would be named Titanic. In 1896, Hannah Josephine Dunton Widener died aboard the family yacht at Bar Harbor, Maine. She was 60 years old. She and Peter had been married for nearly 4 decades, had raised 2 sons, had watched the fortune multiply beyond anything the bricklayer's grandson could have imagined in his youth. Now she was gone, and Peter Widener, 61 years old and among the richest men in America, found himself alone in a Philadelphia townhouse overflowing with paintings he had collected for her pleasure as much as his own. Within a year, he had commissioned a new house, not an addition, not a renovation, a monument. The architect he chose was Horace Trumbauer, a Philadelphia native who had never attended architecture school but had taught himself the craft through apprenticeship and relentless study of European models. Trumbauer was in his late 20s when Widener summoned him young, largely unknown, hungry in the way that produces either greatness or ruin. Widener had seen his work on smaller commissions around the city. He recognized something in the young man's drawings, an understanding that architecture, at this scale, was not about shelter, it was about statement. The site Widener selected lay 8 miles north of Center City, in a township called Cheltenham, that was then still farmland and country estates. He purchased 300 acres of rolling Pennsylvania landscape, enough room for the house he envisioned, its gardens, its outbuildings, its farms and greenhouses, and sufficient buffer to ensure that no neighbor would ever look down upon his roof. Construction began in 1897. The budget was $8 million, equivalent to more than $200 million today. The timeline was 24 months. Both figures seem impossible now, when projects of this scale routinely consume decades and billions. But Widener had spent his career building systems that moved on schedule, and Trumbauer understood that delays would not be tolerated. The house that rose from that Pennsylvania hillside defied easy description. Trumbauer drew from English Palladian precedents the balanced symmetry, the classical proportions, the sense of permanence that Georgian architecture conveys. But the scale was American, which is to say, excessive. The principal facade stretched 268 feet across, punctuated by 6 Corinthian columns rising 2 full stories to support an elaborate pediment. The building extended 215 feet deep, forming a T-shape that organized the interior into distinct zones: public rooms at the front, private quarters in the wings, service areas hidden from view. Indiana limestone clad the exterior pale, fine-grained, quarried from the same deposits that would later face the Empire State Building and the Pentagon. Beneath the stone, a skeleton of steel I-beams and a foot of poured concrete between floors made the structure as close to fireproof as 19th century engineering could achieve. This was not merely a house, it was a vault. The interior spaces required their own vocabulary. Widener engaged the French firm Carlier et Fils to design rooms that would hold his art collection without overwhelming it, a delicate balance, given that the collection already included works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Van Dyck, and El Greco. The solution was a series of 5 galleries, 1 on the ground floor, 4 on the second. Each was named for an artist whose work it would display: the Rembrandt Room, the Van Dyck Room, the Cellini Room, with its niches designed for Renaissance gold work. Paintings hung against walls covered in red velvet, lit by skylights engineered to filter northern light. The ballroom could accommodate 1,000 guests. Its ceiling was not painted, but transplanted an 18th century fresco by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, removed from an Italian palazzo, shipped across the Atlantic, and reinstalled in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, where cherubs and classical figures now gazed down upon American industrialists and their wives. The house contained secrets as well as splendors. Behind the butler's pantry, concealed from the architectural plans filed with the township, lay a room lined with 14 velvet-cushioned safes. No one outside the family knew it existed. What it held: jewelry, documents, cash, items too valuable or too compromising for the galleries, remains unknown. And then there was the enfilade, running the length of the principal floor, a sequence of doorways aligned so precisely that a visitor standing at one end could see clear through to the other, 268 feet of unobstructed sightline, the longest in any residential building in the United States. The effect was deliberate. It announced that here was space without limit, wealth without constraint, a family that need never feel crowded by the world. On December 19, 1899, Linwood Hall opened with a gala for 400 guests. The New York Symphony performed. The soprano Johanna Gadsky sang. Peter Widener, 65 years old, stood in his limestone palace and received the society that had once looked down upon butchers' sons and traction magnates. His wife was not there to see it. His 2 sons were George, the elder, with his wife Eleanor and their 3 young children, and Joseph, the younger, who would eventually inherit it all. The grandchildren ran through rooms that seemed to have no end. One of those grandchildren was a 14-year-old boy named Harry Elkins Widener. He would live in this house for the next 12 years. He would fill his bedroom with books. And in April of 1912, he would board a ship to England to buy more of them, never suspecting that the voyage home would be his last. Harry Elkins Widener was born on January 3, 1885, in Philadelphia, into circumstances that most Americans could not imagine. His father, George Dunton Widener, was the elder son of Peter Widener, and heir apparent to the traction fortune. His mother, Eleanor Elkins, was the daughter of William Lukens Elkins, his grandfather's business partner. The marriage had united the two largest streetcar fortunes in Philadelphia. Harry entered the world as the first grandchild of both dynasties, a position that carried expectations he would spend his brief life alternately fulfilling and escaping. The family moved into Linwood Hall when Harry was 14. By then, his character was already forming along lines that distinguished him from the businessman who had built the fortune he would inherit. He was studious where they had been practical, contemplative where they had been aggressive. He collected things not for investment, not for display, but for the pleasure of possession and the intimacy of study. At the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, a private academy that prepared the sons of wealthy families for the Ivy League, Harry discovered books, not merely reading them, which any educated young man did, but acquiring them seeking out first editions, rare printings, volumes with interesting provenances, or unusual bindings. He graduated in 1903 and proceeded to Harvard College, where the collecting instinct deepened into something closer to obsession. His first serious purchase came in 1905. During his junior year, a third edition presentation copy of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, acquired for $200, roughly $5,500 in modern currency. It was not a fortune, even then. But it established a principle that would guide his collecting for the rest of his life. In a letter to the bookseller Luther Livingston, written in May of 1910, Harry articulated his philosophy with unusual clarity. No matter how important a book or MS may be, he wrote, "I only want those which interest me." He was not building a library to impress. He was building a library to inhabit. At Harvard, Harry joined the Hasty Pudding Theatricals and the Owl Club, as expected of young men in his position. But he also joined the Grolier Club, a society of bibliophiles that took rare books seriously as objects of study rather than mere tokens of wealth. He graduated in 1907 at 22 years old and returned to Linwood Hall with no particular profession and no urgent need for one. The traction companies would provide. His father managed the family's business interests. His grandfather, approaching 80, presided over the estate and its art collection. Harry's domain was his bedroom, which was also his library. The room filled with books, eventually 3,300 volumes, including the first 4 Shakespeare folios, works by Dickens and Robert Louis Stevenson, rare costume books with hand-colored plates, editions that other collectors would have displayed behind glass, but that Harry kept close enough to touch. A friend later recalled that books to him were personal friends. He lived with them. He slept among them. By the time he was 25, Harry Elkins Widener was one of the most serious young book collectors in America. He corresponded with dealers in London and New York. He attended auctions. He knew what he wanted and could afford to get it. He had no way of knowing how little time remained to use that knowledge. At the Hill School today, a bronze plaque marks his memory. The text concludes, "When death met him on the Titanic, he faced it gallantly and unafraid." It is a Victorian sentiment, shaped by grief and the conventions of the era. Whether it is true, whether Harry Widener faced death gallantly, or with terror, or with simple incomprehension, no one who survived could say. For 13 years, Linwood Hall functioned as Peter Widener had designed it to function as a machine for perpetuating a dynasty. 3 generations lived beneath its roof. Peter occupied the principal suite. Surrounded by the art collection, he continued to expand with what Fortune magazine would later describe as the appetite of a greedy boy plundering apples from an orchard. His elder son, George, and daughter-in-law, Eleanor, maintained their own apartments in the East Wing, raising 3 children in rooms that seemed to multiply the further one walked from the entrance hall. Harry, the eldest grandchild, had his book-filled bedroom. George Jr., 4 years younger, had his own quarters. Their sister Eleanor, born in 1891, grew up in a house where Rembrandts lined the corridors and servants outnumbered family members by a ratio that no one bothered to calculate. The art collection anchored everything. By the early 1900s, Peter Widener had assembled one of the most significant private holdings in America, 14 Rembrandts alone, plus works by Vermeer, Raphael, Titian, El Greco, Van Dyck, Gainsborough, and dozens of lesser masters whose names still commanded respect in auction houses. Contemporary estimates valued the collection between $15 and $50 million, a range so wide it suggests that even experts could not agree on how to price what Widener had gathered. The paintings hung in the 5 galleries Trumbauer had designed for them. Each room calibrated to its contents, the Rembrandt room somber and richly lit, the Van Dyck room more spacious to accommodate the full-length portraits that artists favored. Widener did not hoard his collection. Each year, from June through October, the galleries opened to the public by appointment. Visitors who wrote ahead and presented themselves respectably at the gate could walk through rooms that rivaled any museum in the country. Joseph Widener, Peter's younger son, eventually installed chairs, benches, and a system of speakers playing soft music so that guests could contemplate the paintings in comfort. It was philanthropy of a peculiar Gilded Age variety, generous, yet controlled, extending access without surrendering ownership. The household required a permanent staff whose precise number went unrecorded, but certainly exceeded 30. Gardeners maintained the 33 acres of ornamental grounds. Stable hands looked after the horses. A small army of maids, cooks, valets, and footmen kept the interior immaculate, and the family fed, dressed, and transported according to schedules that revolved around social obligations as fixed as planetary orbits. George Dunton Widener, Harry's father, managed much of this machinery. He had joined his father's business interests after his marriage to Eleanor Elkins in 1883, a union that merged the 2 dominant streetcar fortunes in Philadelphia and produced a combined wealth that placed the family among the richest in America. George served on the boards of the Philadelphia Traction Company, the Land Title Bank and Trust, the Electric Storage Battery Company, and a half-dozen other enterprises. He was a director of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He held the position of senior warden at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park, where the family worshipped and where, in time, memorial windows would be dedicated in his name. From the outside, the household appeared permanent, a fixed point in a changing world, anchored by limestone and steel and the seemingly inexhaustible flow of 5-cent streetcar fares. The children grew up expecting that the house would pass to them and to their children and onward through generations not yet imagined. The galleries would always hold their Rembrandts. The ballroom would always accommodate 1,000 guests. The enfilade would always offer its 268-foot vista of rooms opening onto rooms, wealth giving way to more wealth, with no visible end. In the spring of 1912, George and Eleanor Widener began planning a trip to Europe. They would take Harry with them. They booked passage home on a new ship, the largest and most luxurious ocean liner ever built, scheduled to make its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York in April. The name of the ship was Titanic. In March of 1912, the Widener party departed New York aboard RMS Mauretania, bound for Liverpool. There were 5 of them: George Dunton Widener, 50 years old, his wife Eleanor, 50, their son Harry, 27, George's valet, Edwin Herbert Keeping, and Eleanor's maid, Amelie Giger. They travelled first class, as the family always did, with luggage sufficient for an extended stay on the continent. The journey had several purposes. George needed to find a chef for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel he was developing in Philadelphia, a venture that required European talent and European standards. Eleanor needed to purchase a wedding trousseau for their daughter, also named Eleanor, who was engaged to marry Fitz-Eugene Dixon later that spring. The Paris couturiers offered designs unavailable in America. A gown was commissioned, fitted, and packed for the return voyage. And Harry, as always, wanted books. From Liverpool, the party made their way to London, where Harry called upon Bernard Quaritch, the preeminent rare book dealer of the era. The Quaritch firm, founded in 1847, had supplied collectors and institutions across Europe and America for more than half a century. Harry was a known client, serious and well-funded. He came looking for specific items and found them. The centerpiece of his purchases was a 1598 second edition of Francis Bacon's Essays, a small volume, barely larger than a man's hand, containing 58 essays on subjects ranging from truth to gardens to the nature of death. The price was approximately £260, substantial but not extravagant for a book of such rarity. Harry also acquired a 1542 pamphlet titled Heavy News of a Horrible Earthquake, believed to be the only surviving copy a curiosity that appealed to his taste for the unusual and the fragile. Most of his purchases he arranged to ship separately, on another vessel. The books would travel on RMS Carpathia, scheduled to arrive in New York around the same time as the Wideners themselves. It was a sensible precaution. Rare volumes and ocean crossings made uneasy companions. But the Bacon, according to a story that circulated after the disaster, Harry kept with him. The bookseller, A.S. W. Rosenbach later claimed that Harry had told Quaritch, "I think I'll take that little Bacon with me in my pocket, and if I am shipwrecked, it will go with me." The remark has the ring of the kind of thing people say without meaning a joke, a superstition, a young man's bravado in the face of improbability. Eleanor Widener, who survived, never confirmed the story. Whether Harry actually carried the book aboard and whether it went down with him into the North Atlantic remains unknown. From London, the party travelled to Paris, where they stayed at the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme. The address would later appear among the effects recovered from Edwin Keeping's body, a scrap of paper noting where the valet had last slept on dry land. Eleanor completed her shopping. George conducted his business. Harry, presumably, haunted the bookstores along the Seine. By early April, they were ready to return home. The ship they had booked was new, so new it had not yet carried a single paying passenger. RMS Titanic, built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast for the White Star Line, was the largest ocean liner in the world, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide, displacing 46,000 tons. The publicity promised unsinkable construction, unprecedented luxury, a crossing that would feel less like travel than like residence in a floating palace. On April 10, 1912, the Widener party boarded at Cherbourg, France, having crossed the Channel from England. Their ticket number was Elenville 353. The fare was £211 and 10 shillings, roughly $25,000 in modern currency. George and Eleanor occupied cabin C-80. Harry took cabin C-82, adjacent to his parents. Keeping and Giga were assigned quarters elsewhere, in the modest accommodations reserved for servants travelling with first-class passengers. The ship weighed anchor and turned toward the open Atlantic. New York lay 6 days away. The weather was calm, the sea smooth, the night sky moonless and thick with stars. The 14th of April dawned clear and cold over the North Atlantic. Titanic had been at sea for 4 days, steaming westward at 22 knots through waters that grew colder with each passing hour. The ship's passengers, insulated by mahogany paneling and steam heat, and the ministrations of a staff that outnumbered them, noticed the chill only when they ventured onto the open decks. That afternoon, George and Eleanor Widener took a promenade along the first-class deck. They encountered J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, who was travelling aboard for the maiden voyage. As they walked, Captain Edward John Smith passed them on his way aft. He carried a slip of paper, a wireless message from the steamship Baltic, warning of ice ahead. Ismay pocketed the message. The conversation continued. The ship did not slow. By evening, the temperature had dropped further. Passengers who had spent the afternoon in deck chairs retreated to the warmth of the public rooms, the libraries and lounges and smoking rooms that made Titanic feel less like a vessel than a country estate temporarily set afloat. The first-class dining saloon filled with the usual crowd, but the Wideners were not among them. They had made other arrangements. According to passenger accounts and Titanic historians, George Widener hosted a dinner that evening in the ship's a la carte restaurant, a separate establishment from the main dining saloon, operated by the Italian restaurateur Luigi Gatti, for passengers who preferred continental cuisine and a more intimate setting. The dinner honoured Captain Smith, a gesture of appreciation from a first-class passenger to the commander who had made their crossing so pleasant. The guest list, reconstructed from survivor testimony and historical research, included some of the most prominent names aboard: John Borland Thayer, second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, attended with his wife Marion. Major Archibald Butt, military aide to President Taft, was present, a man who had served 2 administrations and who, by most accounts, would spend the final hours of his life helping women and children into lifeboats without ever attempting to save himself. Clarence Moore, a Washington sportsman and master of the Chevy chase hunt, joined the party. William Ernest Carter, a Philadelphia polo player, came with his wife, Lucille. Eleanor Widener wore pearl jewelry that night. The exact pieces she chose went unrecorded, but she was known for her collection, assembled over decades of marriage to one of the richest men in Philadelphia. The jeweler's circular would later report that a pearl necklace survived the sinking, worn around her neck as she escaped in the lifeboat. The value was disputed even at the time. Estimates ranged from $100,000 to $750,000, but the fact of survival was confirmed. The pearls made it. Her husband and son did not. The dinner proceeded through multiple courses, served by Gatti's staff on White Star china. The conversation, unrecorded, likely touched on the crossing, the ship, the plans awaiting them in New York. Captain Smith, 62 years old and commanding what would be his final voyage before retirement, presided with the quiet authority that had made him the most sought-after captain in the transatlantic trade. Wealthy passengers requested him by name. They trusted him. He had never lost a ship. Before 9 o'clock, Smith excused himself from the table. He was needed on the bridge. The ship was entering the ice region warned of in the afternoon's wireless messages, and though the night was calm and the sea flat, prudence required his presence. He thanked his hosts. He bid the guests good evening. He climbed the stairs to the bridge and did not return. The dinner party broke up sometime after. The ladies retired to their cabins or to the reception room for coffee. The men lingered in the first-class smoking room, where cards were played and brandy was served, and the hour grew late without anyone minding. Harry Widener was among them, though what he said or did in those final hours of ordinary life went unrecorded. Outside, the Atlantic lay black and still. The stars overhead were brilliant, so brilliant that several passengers would later remark on them, not knowing that the exceptional visibility meant exceptional cold, meant ice, meant danger. The ship's lookouts, stationed in the crow's nest without binoculars, strained to see what the darkness concealed. At 20 minutes before midnight, the night was quiet. The engines thrummed. The wake spread white behind the stern. 1,500 people slept or talked or played cards, suspended above 2 miles of black water, unaware that they had approximately 40 minutes of normal life remaining. At 11:40, Frederick Fleet, the lookout, saw something in the darkness ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. The officer on watch ordered the helm hard to starboard. The engines reversed. For 37 seconds, Titanic turned slowly, impossibly slowly. 882 feet of steel trying to pivot away from a mountain of ice that had drifted south from Greenland and now sat directly in her path. The ship struck a glancing blow along the starboard side. The sound, passengers later recalled, was not dramatic. A slight shudder, a grinding noise, the clatter of ice falling onto the forward well deck. In the smoking room, the card games paused. Someone made a joke. Then the games resumed. The damage was invisible from inside the ship. Titanic's collision with the iceberg had opened a 300-foot gash along her starboard hull, below the waterline, rupturing the first 5 watertight compartments. The ship could float with 4 compartments flooded. She could not float with 5. Within 10 minutes of the collision, Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, had calculated what no passenger yet understood Titanic was going to sink. The only question was how long it would take. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered. The wireless operators began transmitting distress signals. The ship's orchestra, stationed in the first-class lounge, began to play ragtime at first, then hymns, then whatever came to mind as the hours wore on, and the deck tilted imperceptibly toward the bow. In the first-class cabins and corridors, confusion reigned longer than panic. Stewards knocked on doors with instructions to put on lifebelts and report to the boat deck. Many passengers ignored them. The ship felt solid underfoot. The lights burned steadily. The notion that this floating palace could actually founder seemed, to people who had paid thousands of dollars for the privilege of sailing on her, frankly absurd. George Widener roused his wife. Eleanor dressed there was time for that. In the early hours when urgency had not yet displaced propriety, and put on her pearl necklace. Whether she did so deliberately or from habit, whether she understood that she might be dressing for the last time in a proper stateroom, no one recorded. The pearls would survive. They would be noted in trade publications weeks later, confirmed safe, worn around her neck as she escaped. Harry joined his parents in the corridor. Edwin Keeping, George's valet, appeared from the servants' quarters. Amelie Giger, Eleanor's maid, followed. The 5 of them made their way to the boat deck. where the evacuation was beginning in earnest. The scene on deck was not yet chaos, but neither was it orderly. Officers shouted instructions that passengers could barely hear over the roar of steam escaping from the ship's funnels. The lifeboats, designed to hold 65 people each, were being lowered. Half-empty officers feared the davits would buckle under full weight, and passengers feared the small wooden boats more than they feared the enormous steel ship. Women refused to leave their husbands. Husbands refused to force them. Boats descended with 20 people, 30 people, gaps on the benches where 50 more could have sat. Lifeboat 4 was assigned to the port side, near the first-class entrance. The Wideners made their way there, along with other prominent passengers, Madeline Astor, 18 years old and pregnant, whose husband, John Jacob Astor, was the richest man aboard. Emily Ryerson, who had cut short a European trip upon learning of her son's death in an automobile accident and was now facing a second unimaginable loss. Marion Thayer, wife of the Pennsylvania Railroad executive, who had dined with the Wideners just hours before. There was a problem with the windows. Lifeboat 4 was to be loaded through the promenade deck windows rather than from the open boat deck, but the windows were locked, and no one could find the proper tools to open them. The delay lasted nearly an hour. Passengers waited, lifebelts fastened, while crew members searched for a means to access the boat that was supposed to save them. During that hour, Eleanor Widener refused to leave her husband's side. Contemporary accounts, reported in the days after the sinking, describe her resistance a wife unwilling to accept that the categories of survivor and victim were about to divide her family. George insisted. The boats were for women and children. He and Harry would find another way, or they would wait for rescue. The ship was sending signals. Other vessels were coming. There was no need for everyone to crowd into the lifeboats. The Washington Times reported 4 days later that George Widener kissed his wife goodbye before she stepped into the lifeboat. The headline read, "Widener was heroic to end, says friend." The subhead, "Traction, magnate kissed wife goodbye, then went back to die." The source was a friend of the family, not Eleanor herself. She gave no interviews, then or ever, about what happened that night. At approximately 1:55 in the morning, Lifeboat 4 was finally lowered. Eleanor and Amelie Giger were aboard, along with Madeline Astor, Emily Ryerson, Marion Thayer, and perhaps 40 others. The boat descended 75 feet from the promenade deck to the water, swaying on its ropes, the women inside looking up at the ship that still blazed with light above them. George and Harry stood at the rail. They did not attempt to board. The rule was women and children first, and they were neither. According to survivor William Carter, the Philadelphia polo player who had dined with the Wideners that evening, he encountered Harry on deck after Eleanor's boat had departed. Carter advised him to find a lifeboat, to try his chances before they were all gone. Harry reportedly replied, "I'll stick to the big ship, Billy, and take a chance." Carter survived. He reached Collapsible Sea, one of the last boats launched, and climbed aboard in the final minutes before the ship went under. His account of Harry's words cannot be verified, but it has passed into the historical record, repeated in Walter Lord's A Night to Remember, and in every subsequent telling of the Widener story. Colonel Archibald Gracie, another survivor, later recalled seeing George Widener in the final hour, leaning against the railing in deep discussion with John Borland Thayer. The two men, both Pennsylvania businessmen, both fathers, both trapped on a sinking ship while their wives descended to safety, stood together as the bow sank lower and the stern rose higher and the great propellers lifted out of the water into the freezing air. George Widener, Harry Widener, John Thayer, and a man named Charles Duane Williams were last seen together. All four perished. At 2:20 in the morning, Titanic broke apart and sank. The stern section rose nearly vertical, hung suspended for a moment against the stars, and then plunged downward. More than 1,500 people entered water that measured 28 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that gave them only minutes. The lifeboats drifted in the darkness. From the water came sounds that those aboard would never forget and never speak of. Most boats did not go back. The passengers feared being swamped by swimmers, feared the suction of the sinking ship, feared what they might find if they rowed back toward the wreckage. Lifeboat 4 did return, eventually, and pulled a few survivors from the water. George and Harry Widener were not among them. Their bodies were never recovered, or if recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, which spent days collecting the dead from the North Atlantic, never identified. At Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, in the Widener family mausoleum, cenotaphs bear their names. The vaults behind those markers are empty. Eleanor sat in Lifeboat 4, the pearls still around her neck, and watched the lights of Titanic disappear beneath the sea. Her husband of 29 years was gone. Her firstborn son was gone. Her maid sat beside her. The Atlantic was still. The stars burned overhead, indifferent. She would live another 25 years. She would never speak publicly about what she saw that night. RMS Carpathia reached New York on the evening of April 18, 1912, carrying 705 survivors from Titanic. The pier at Cunard's berth was mobbed reporters, families desperate for news, curiosity seekers drawn by the scale of the disaster. Flashbulbs exploded in the rain. Names were shouted into the chaos. Eleanor Widener did not pass through that crowd. A private train waited for her at a separate location, arranged by the family through connections that still functioned even in catastrophe. She and Amelie Giger, her maid, boarded the train and departed for Philadelphia without speaking to the press, without facing the photographers, without adding her grief to the public spectacle of mourning that would consume the nation for weeks. The train carried her back to Linwood Hall. The house stood as she had left it 6 weeks earlier, 110 rooms, 70,000 square feet, the limestone facade pale against the spring sky. The staff had received word by telegram. They knew that Mr. Widener and Mr. Harry would not be returning. They knew that the mistress was coming home alone. What passed between Eleanor and the household in those first hours went unrecorded. The chandeliers still burned in the great enfilade. The Tiepolo ceiling still depicted gods and cherubs at play above the ballroom. The Rembrandts still hung in their gallery, lit by skylights that filtered Pennsylvania sun through the same angles they had filtered it the week before. Nothing had changed except that 2 of the bedrooms would never be occupied again. Peter Widener, 77 years old, received his daughter-in-law in the house he had built for a dynasty that was now broken. His elder son was dead. His eldest grandson was dead. His younger son Joseph remained, and Joseph's children. But the line of succession that had seemed so certain, George inheriting the business, Harry inheriting the books, grandchildren inheriting the house, had been severed in a single night. A memorial service was held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park, where George Dunton Widener had served as senior warden. The congregation that gathered included Philadelphia society, business associates, family connections reaching across decades of streetcar deals and art acquisitions. There were no bodies to bury. The service honored men whose remains lay somewhere in the North Atlantic, 2 miles down, in water so cold that nothing decayed. Stained glass windows by Tiffany were commissioned for the church memorials in colored light to the father and son who had worshipped there. One body from the Widener party was recovered. Edwin Herbert Keeping, George's valet, was recovered by the cable ship Mackay Bennett and buried at sea on April 21st, 6 days after the sinking. He was designated body number 45. The official record noted his effects a gold watch and chain, a locket containing photographs of his wife Caroline and their 3-year-old daughter Mildred, a pocketbook with a diamond and ruby tie pin, a cigarette case, keys, and a lucky cent. His clothing included a grey overcoat marked EK on the inside pocket. Keeping was buried at sea on April 21st. His wife, Caroline, a Swedish immigrant who had also worked for the Widener household, received word of his death in the days that followed. According to Titanic historians, Eleanor Widener established a trust providing annual payments to Caroline and Mildred for the rest of their lives. Caroline never remarried. She and her daughter eventually returned to Sweden, where Mildred died in 1978, years after her father sank into the Atlantic, with photographs of his family pressed against his chest. 6 weeks after the sinking, on June 19, 1912, Eleanor Widener Dixon, the daughter for whom the Paris trousseau had been purchased, married Fitz-Eugene Dixon at Linwood Hall. The wedding had been planned for months as a lavish affair, the social event of the Philadelphia season. Instead, it became a quiet ceremony, shadowed by loss, attended by family and close friends rather than the hundreds originally invited. The wedding dress, purchased in Paris, had gone down with the ship. Eleanor Dixon wore a different gown. Life at Linwood Hall continued, because life continues, because the machinery of wealth and household and social obligation does not pause for grief. But the house had changed. It would never again hold the family it was built to hold. And within 3 years, the patriarch who had constructed it would follow his son and grandson into death. 8 months after the Titanic sank, Eleanor Widener began negotiations with Harvard University. Her son had graduated from Harvard in 1907. His book collection, 3,300 volumes of rare editions, first printings, Shakespeare folios, illustrated costume books, works by Dickens and Stevenson remained at Linwood Hall, in the bedroom that had served as his library. Eleanor proposed to donate the collection to Harvard, along with the funds to house it properly. On December 31st, 1912, an agreement was signed. Eleanor would give $2 million. Some sources cite $3.5 million when subsequent endowments are included for the construction of a memorial library in her son's name. It was the largest gift in Harvard's history to that date, and it came with conditions that the university accepted without argument. The architect Eleanor chose was Horace Trumbauer, the same man who had designed Linwood Hall for her father-in-law 15 years earlier. Trumbauer was now 50 years old and at the height of his reputation, responsible for mansions, museums, and institutional buildings across the eastern seaboard. His chief designer for the Harvard project was Julian Francis Abel, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Architecture School and the first prominent African-American architect in the country. Abel would never see the building he designed as a black man. He was reportedly not welcome on Harvard's campus during construction. The site selected was Harvard Yard, opposite Memorial Church, where the previous college library, Gore Hall, had stood since 1838. Gore Hall was cramped, humid, and inadequate to Harvard's expanding collections. It would be demolished to make way for the Widener Memorial. Groundbreaking occurred on February 11, 1913, in the middle of a Massachusetts winter. The ground was frozen solid. Workers maintained bonfires for 48 hours to soften the earth enough for ceremonial digging. George Dunton Widener Jr., Harry's younger brother, 23 years old, the surviving son, lifted the first shovel of soil. Construction proceeded over the next 2 years. The building that rose in Harvard Yard was massive by any standard, 250 feet wide, 200 feet deep, 80 feet high at the cornice. 10 levels of stacks would eventually hold 320,000 square feet of usable space, 57 miles of shelving, 5 miles of aisles. The facade, modeled on classical precedents, featured a broad flight of stairs leading to a colonnade of Corinthian columns, a temple of learning built with streetcar money, dedicated to a young man who had died before his 28th birthday. At the heart of the building, Eleanor specified a memorial room. Harry's collection would be housed there in English oak panels carved in England and shipped across the Atlantic. His portrait would hang above the fireplace. Fresh flowers would be placed beneath it daily, a requirement that Harvard has honored for more than a century, without interruption, without exception. Eleanor attached one absolute condition to her gift: not a brick, stone, or piece of mortar shall be changed. The building was to remain as constructed, in perpetuity, as a memorial to her son. Harvard agreed. Decades later, when the university needed to connect Widener Library to the adjacent Houghton Library, architects found a solution that honored the letter of Eleanor's stipulation. They ran the breezeway through a window rather than alter the wall. The dedication ceremony took place on June 24, 1915, commencement day, 3 years and 2 months after Harry Widener drowned in the North Atlantic. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge delivered the keynote address. "This noble gift to learning," he said, "comes to us with the shadow of a great sorrow resting upon it." A legend later attached itself to the library, claiming that Eleanor had required all Harvard graduates to pass a swimming test, believing that Harry might have survived had he known how to swim. The story persisted for decades, repeated in guidebooks and campus tours, offered as explanation for a requirement that generations of Harvard students found bewildering. It was false. Harvard's swimming requirement predated Harry's attendance by years and had nothing to do with the Widener donation. Eleanor never made such a demand. The legend survived anyway, because legends often do. Eleanor also donated $300,000 to the Hill School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, where Harry had graduated in 1903. The gift funded the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Science Building, which included a library. Horace Trumbauer designed that building as well. By the summer of 1915, Harry Widener's name was inscribed in stone at Harvard, at Hill School, and at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Elkins Park. His books sat in English oak cases beneath his portrait. His body remained where it had fallen, somewhere in the North Atlantic, 2 miles down. Before the Titanic voyage, George Widener had commissioned another house, not a replacement for Linwood Hall. Nothing could replace that but a summer residence in Newport, Rhode Island, where Philadelphia society migrated each August to escape the heat and to see and be seen among the cottages of the very rich. The architect was Horace Trumbauer, as it had been for Linwood Hall. The site was 7.5 acres on Rhode Island Sound, with views across Narragansett Bay. The design drew from the Hotel de Cassini in Paris, French neoclassical, formal, suited to entertaining on a scale that Newport demanded. 30,000 square feet, 27 bedrooms, 14 bathrooms, a dining room modelled on chambers at Versailles. George had planned it for his family, for summers that would stretch across generations, for the life he expected to live into old age. He died before construction was complete. Eleanor could have abandoned the project. She had Linwood Hall. She had no need for another mansion. But in 1913, a year after the sinking, she directed that construction resume. Perhaps she wanted to complete what George had started. Perhaps she wanted a house that was hers alone, unshared with her father-in-law and his art collection. Perhaps she simply needed something to build. Miramar was completed in 1914, or 1915 sources disagree on the exact date, at a cost of approximately $1.5 million, equivalent to $47 million today. On August 20th, 1915, Eleanor hosted an inaugural reception that the Society pages called the highlight of the Newport summer season. She was 53 years old, a widow for 3 years, and she stood in a house that her dead husband had imagined but never seen. 2 months earlier, she had attended the dedication of the Widener Library at Harvard. Among the dignitaries present was Alexander Hamilton Rice Jr., a Harvard professor with an unusual combination of credentials. He was a surgeon, a South American explorer, and what one historian called a certified Boston Brahmin, old money, old family, impeccable connections. Rice had spent years mapping uncharted regions of the Amazon basin, leading expeditions into territory where few outsiders had ventured. Eleanor was 53. Rice was 53. They shared, perhaps, a certain restlessness, a sense that life at the expected scale was insufficient. On October 6, 1915, Eleanor Elkins Widener married Alexander Hamilton Rice Jr. in a ceremony led by Bishop William Lawrence. She wore, according to reports, a celebrated string of pearls, whether the same pearls she had worn escaping from Titanic or others from her collection. The accounts do not specify. She gave up her Philadelphia residence and divided her time between Newport, New York, Paris, and wherever her new husband's expeditions took him, which turned out to be the Amazon. For the first few years of her second marriage, Eleanor supported Rice's expeditions from a distance, funding equipment, corresponding with universities, hosting the geographers and naturalists who passed through their homes. But by 1920, supporting was no longer enough. She wanted to go. That year, Eleanor accompanied Rice on an expedition that took her, according to a New York Times obituary, further up the Amazon than any white woman had penetrated. The journey did not proceed smoothly. On May 1st, 1920, the New York Tribune published a headline that would have seemed implausible applied to the widow of a Philadelphia streetcar magnate. Explorers kill cannibals. Former Mrs. Widener shares perils in South America. The obituary, written in the language of its era, described an encounter with indigenous people that turned violent. Eleanor, the account noted, had remained on the specially constructed yacht during the incident. The expedition was abandoned on the advice of their indigenous guides. They returned to civilization, regrouped, and went back. In 1924, the Rices disappeared into the Amazon for so long that international anxiety mounted. Newspapers speculated about their fate. When they finally emerged, a headline announced, "Explorer Rice denies that he was eaten by cannibals." Eleanor, the Titanic widow, had become an adventurer. She traveled to regions without maps, funded research into territories that the Brazilian government had barely acknowledged, built schools for indigenous children in areas where no schools had existed. The woman who had stood at the rail of Lifeboat 4, watching her husband and son recede into darkness, had found a way to move forward, not by retreating into grief, but by pushing into jungles that could kill her as surely as the North Atlantic had killed them. She lived until 1937. On July 13th of that year, Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice died of a heart attack in a Paris store. She was 75 years old. Her body was returned to Philadelphia and interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery in the Widener family mausoleum, beside the cenotaphs of George and Harry. Her crypt makes no mention of the Titanic. The empty vaults of her husband and son do. She had outlived George by 25 years. She had gone further up the Amazon than any white woman before her. She had remarried, explored, endured, and in the end, she died in Paris, shopping an ordinary death in an ordinary place after an extraordinary life. Peter Widener died at Linwood Hall on November 6, 1915, 3 years after the Titanic took his son and grandson. He was 80 years old. The newspapers called his death the result of prolonged poor health. But those who knew him understood that grief had contributed. He had built a dynasty, and the dynasty had broken. His younger son Joseph inherited the estate and the art collection. For the next 27 years, Joseph Widener maintained Linwood Hall, as his father had maintained it. The galleries open to visitors each summer, the staff preserving the rooms, the gardens tended by crews that shrank as the decades passed, and the fortune, though still vast, no longer seemed inexhaustible. But Joseph's son, Peter Arrol Brown Widener II, had rendered his verdict years before his father's death. In a 1940 autobiography titled Without Drums, he wrote of the house where he had grown up. "It's a museum, not a home. It's as cold and as formal as if real people didn't live here." He called Linwood Hall the last American Versailles and predicted accurately that the days of America's privately owned treasure houses are over. In 1942, Joseph Widener donated the family's art collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. More than 2,000 works paintings, sculptures, decorative arts, works on paper left Linwood Hall for the galleries that Andrew Mellon had built on the National Mall. 14 Rembrandts, Vermeer's Woman, Holding a Balance, works by Raphael, Titian, Van Dyck, Gainsborough. The collection that Peter Widener had assembled, like a greedy boy plundering apples from an orchard, was now public property, available to anyone who walked through the museum's doors. Joseph Widener died at Linwood Hall on October 26, 1943. He was 72 years old, the last Widener to live in the house full-time. His son had long since moved to the converted stables on the property, preferring their modest scale to the 110 rooms of the main house. His daughter-in-law would later say that Joseph's mother had died alone in that great, lonely house. Now Joseph had done the same. The following year, the contents of Linwood Hall were auctioned. For a $1 admission fee, the public was invited inside the mansion that had been closed to casual visitors for nearly half a century. They came by the hundreds: dealers, collectors, curiosity seekers, Philadelphia residents who had driven past the limestone facade for years without ever seeing what lay behind it. Life magazine sent photographers to document the event. The auction lasted 5 days. A tapestry-covered sofa and 8 matching chairs that had belonged to Louis XV sold for $30,000, the highest price of the sale. The Philadelphia Museum of Art acquired a Persian rug measuring 31 feet by 12 feet for $87,500. Furniture, silverware, cookware, automobiles. Everything that could be moved was catalogued and sold. One photograph from the coverage reportedly showed embossed Widener silver being placed in the trunk of an automobile. balanced atop a spare tire. The image, if it existed, captured something the Wideners themselves might not have been able to articulate: the end of an era reduced to objects, loaded into cars, driven away by strangers. The auction raised $337,000. The house itself remained unsold. That same year, George Dunton Widener Jr. and his sister Eleanor Widener Dixon donated a Gutenberg Bible to Harvard's Widener Library, one of 48 surviving copies. Peter Widener had purchased it decades earlier, intending it as a gift for Harry. Harry had died before receiving it. Now it joined his other books in the memorial room, beneath his portrait, surrounded by fresh flowers that the university replaced each day. Linwood Hall sat empty. No buyer emerged. None of the Widener descendants wanted it. The house that had cost $8 million to build more than $200 million in modern currency had become unsellable. In 1952, 8 years after the auction, a buyer finally appeared. The Reverend Carl McIntyre, a fundamentalist Presbyterian minister, purchased Linwood Hall for his Faith Theological Seminary. The price was $192,000, equivalent to roughly $2.25 million today. The seminary that would use the mansion for the next 4 decades, training ministers in rooms where Rembrandts had once hung on red velvet walls. The ballroom with its Tiepolo ceiling became a chapel. The galleries became classrooms. The enfilade, the longest residential sightline in America, became a corridor that students walked without knowing what it had once meant. The seminary years were not kind to Linwood Hall. Faith Theological Seminary operated in the mansion for more than 4 decades, training ministers in rooms designed for Rembrandts and Renoir. The Reverend Carl McIntyre, who had purchased the estate for $192,000 in 1952, proved a complicated steward. When the seminary's finances faltered, he addressed the shortfall by selling what could be sold, not the building itself, which he could not legally alter under various deed restrictions, but the fixtures that remained after the 1944 auction. Wood paneling was stripped from walls and sold to collectors. Marble mantelpieces were removed and shipped to buyers across the country. The fountain, designed by the French landscape architect Jacques Grébert, installed in 1916 as part of the formal gardens, was dismantled and dispersed, piece by piece. The interior details that Carlien et Fil had assembled from European chateaux and Italian palazzos found their way into other buildings, other collections, other lives. The roof began to fail. Water seeped through slate tiles that no one could afford to replace, pooling on floors where society had once danced, staining ceilings painted by Italian masters. The Van Dyck Gallery, where red velvet walls had displayed portraits of English aristocrats, was simply closed, the doors shut, the damage sealed away, the room abandoned to decades of slow decay. In 1996, the seminary's financial difficulties culminated in foreclosure. The First Korean Church of New York, an organization with ties to Faith Theological Seminary, acquired Linwood Hall through a sheriff's sale. The new owners intended to establish another religious institution on the property, but disputes over taxes and zoning entangled them in litigation that stretched across years. The mansion sat largely vacant, maintained by a skeleton staff, visited occasionally by urban explorers who documented the deterioration with cameras and posted their findings online. For nearly 3 decades, the house waited. Seasons passed, paint peeled, plaster fell. The grounds grew wild, then were cut back, then grew wild again. Proposals came and went: a hotel, a museum, condominiums, but none survived the financial realities of restoring a 110-room mansion that had been neglected for half a century. The house became famous, in a way famous for its ruin rather than its grandeur. Photographers captured the peeling wallpaper, the collapsed plaster, the galleries where fragments of red velvet still clung to walls that had once held 14 Rembrandts. The enfilade remained intact, 268 feet of doorways aligned so precisely that a visitor could still see from one end of the house to the other, through room after room of emptiness. In June of 2023, Linwood Hall was sold again, this time to the Linwood Hall Preservation Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to restoring the mansion and opening it to the public. The purchase price was $9 million. The estimated cost of restoration runs into the tens of millions more. Asbestos must be remediated. The roof must be stabilized. Electrical and plumbing systems dating to the 19th century must be replaced. But the structure endures. Indiana limestone does not rot. Steel I-beams do not warp. The foot of concrete between each floor, installed by Horace Trumbauer to fireproof the building, has kept the mansion standing through a century of use, neglect, and abandonment. In November of 2024, the Philadelphia Beaux Arts Ball was held at Linwood Hall. Guests in period costume dancing in rooms that had not seen such gatherings since before the First World War. The foundation plans to open the doors to the public in 2026. What survives? The art collection survives more than 2,000 works, now at the National Gallery in Washington, available to anyone who walks through the door. The Rembrandts that Peter Widener assembled hang in climate-controlled galleries, studied by scholars, admired by tourists, preserved for generations that will never know the name Widener unless they read the provenance labels. The library survives not Harry's 3,300 volumes alone, but the building Eleanor funded to house them. The Widener Library at Harvard holds 3.2 million books today, one of the largest academic libraries in the world. In the memorial room, behind glass, Harry's collection remains intact. Fresh flowers are placed beneath his portrait daily, as Eleanor specified, as Harvard has honored for more than a century. The mansion survives barely, but it survives. The second largest Gilded Age house still standing in the United States, waiting for restoration, waiting for visitors, waiting to become something other than a monument to loss. The bodies do not survive, or rather, they survive in a form no one will ever see. George and Harry Widener lie somewhere in the North Atlantic, 12,000 feet down, in water so cold and dark that nothing changes. Their cenotaphs at Laurel Hill Cemetery mark vaults that have always been empty. The house Peter Widener built for his dynasty has outlived the dynasty itself. It has outlived the fortune that constructed it, the art collection that justified it, the family that inhabited it. It stands in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, 8 miles north of Philadelphia, its limestone facade pale against whatever sky appears above it, blue or grey or black with stars, as it was on the night the Titanic sank, the last American Versailles. It is not clear how much longer it will stand, but it has survived more than a century. It may survive another.